as that clock ticks away in Moscow, for Putin, he's expecting that if he can wait out that clock, that eventually the West will falter and he'll be able to turn on Ukraine and have his way. And so the clock I worry about most is that one. We cannot falter as the West.
Evil cannot be trusted, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has told the UN General Assembly, urging the world to unite to end Russian aggression against his country. In a passionate speech in New York, Zelensky said a nuclear-armed Moscow must be stopped from pushing the world to the final war.
Those children in Russia are taught to hate Ukraine, and all ties with their families are broken. And this is clearly a genocide. When hatred is weaponized against one nation, it never stops there. Each decade, Russia starts a new war.
President Joe Biden also urged world leaders not to abandon Ukraine in its war with Russia, warning Russia is pinning its hopes on other nations growing weary of the fight.
An illegal war of conquest brought without provocation by Russia against its neighbor Ukraine. Like every nation in the world, the United States wants this war to end. No nation wants this war to end more than Ukraine. And we strongly support Ukraine in its efforts to bring about a diplomatic resolution that delivers just and lasting peace.
Well, we can now speak with Jim Townsend, former Deputy Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO under both Presidents Obama and Biden. Jim, good to speak to you.
Good to speak to you as well.
President Zelensky, first thing I'd note is his English is improving with every speech that I hear him, and the clarity in the way that he speaks. He's always been passionate and direct about his needs and what he wants, but now delivering it in much better English. And his analysis of what's going on was clear and brutal tonight, wasn't it?
It was, and I noticed that as well in terms of the timbre of his voice. He spoke with his teeth clenched. He spoke with a lot of anger and frustration. And I think that was certainly radiated out to the audience, both in the timbre of his voice and also what he said.
His key point was to warn the international community that the outcome of the war will affect them. He talked about Russia's goal to turn Ukraine into a weapon against you, against the rules-based international order. But it feels like this pitch was aimed squarely at countries, people, including India, who failed to give that declaration at the G7 recently, countries who've stayed on the sidelines, Jim.
Yeah, it's really it's an interesting point. I think that his audience, in a lot of ways, that's appreciative of what he's saying about this being their fight too. That the rules-based international order that they've enjoyed and has brought them prosperity is in danger. That audience is a European, Western audience. I think the so-called global South will sit there and go, well, look, we're in a different place than in terms of the rules-based order. We feel sometimes the rules-based order is not tilted in our direction. And so they seem to kind of sit on their hands. And I think that probably was part of the frustration, too, for Zelensky today as he spoke to this audience. I think a good number of the audience certainly understood what he was saying and agreed with it in terms of the danger that this war brought home to them. But I think there were others that were on the fence. And I think the West has got to do a better job of telling them that, look, no matter what you might think about the rules-based international order, the weaponization of food directly impacts you as well.
Yeah, well, he talked about that, didn't he? The weaponization of food shortages, energy, even nuclear energy. He also talked about children being abducted by parts of Ukraine by the Russians as babies. Incredibly sad stories, of course, that have also been reported on by the Times in the last couple of months. And he also warned against these shady deals to try and end the war on unfair terms. But of course, what he wants is more weapons. He constantly talks about the need for more weapons to finish the war at a speedier pace. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like that's coming, especially not from the biggest provider by far, the US.
Well, that's another story too. While this UN meeting was going on, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Austin and all of his counterparts, I think it's about 50 countries now, were meeting at Ramstein in Germany around the big table there to talk about assistance. This was their periodic meeting of the supporters of Ukraine, and so the support is going to be coming in, including from the U.S. I think what Zelensky is concerned about, and he's not the only one, is that if this is to be finished soon, this war is to be finished soon, potentially, then it's going to have to be done by providing lots of high-end weapons to Ukraine right now and not parceling it out in penny packets over time. And so he's referring particularly to the F-16s, and he's referring to the tanks. And we know that the tanks are being delivered. The UK Challenger has been there for a while.
Yeah.
US Abrams are coming in. The F-16s will be coming in next year. And I'll have to put a pitch in here for the UK. A lot of times it's the UK that has led the charge on providing the high-end weaponry. And I think that's helped us in Washington. There's been a lot of leadership shown out of London on this. But for Zelensky, that's what he says he needs the most is this high-end stuff, as well as the ammunition and the high-end ammunition, like ATACMS and other types of missiles, Storm Shadow, that he needs to really have an impact on the ground.
It is a race against time, isn't it, in many ways? Because if it's a year and 2 months until an American election when things are extremely uncertain, Joe Biden has been a great supporter of Ukraine, but even he is reluctant to commit enormous amounts of money in a general election year in the US. But any commitment that is scaled up really has to come now, because in the event of a change of government in the US, there's no saying that Ukraine would get anywhere near the amount of weaponry that the US is sending to Kyiv at the moment.
Well, we're all worried about that. If Trump were reelected, we would be in a very different place. It's hard enough now with the Republican extremists that are in the House of Representatives who are certainly slowing things up and making it much more difficult to provide the assistance that they need. There's a package before the Congress now that's $40 billion. Of that, I think about 25 billion is assistance. And that will be a test case, I think, to see how the Republicans in the Congress deal with that. But I think there is a clock ticking, and it's not only the electoral process here in the U.S. that's ticking, but also the winter is coming, and there's a louder ticking there in terms of how much can be done before the fighting season pretty much ends. And there's a clock ticking for Putin, too. And I think that Putin clock is one that he feels is going to run out in terms of Western support for Ukraine. And so as that clock ticks away in Moscow for Putin, he's expecting that if he can wait out that clock, that eventually the West will falter and he'll be able to turn on Ukraine and have his way. And so the clock I worry about most is that one. We cannot falter as the West and let that clock run out there in Moscow.
Well, that's what's going on inside Ukraine, because the Ukrainians are advancing, aren't they, Jim? They're trying to advance towards the Sea of Azov and essentially cut off Crimea and cut off the Russian supply routes.
Well, that's right. And that's I guess we have a lot of ticking clocks here. And that is a clock that has been ticking far too slowly for a lot of people. I think there was an expectation or a wish or a naivete on a lot of people that we would see sweeping Ukrainian armies push back the Russians. And unfortunately, the Russians were given too much time to dig in, to build tank traps and multiple lines of World War I like obstacles that have slowed things down. But they have been making progress against those in the south. They've broken through the first line. I think they're about to break through the second line if they haven't done that already. And then I think we'll see some movement, but the winter is coming down as well. And so there's other factors, including Russian reinforcements, that might slow that offensive down. But I think UK and the US know from our experiences in war, in World Wars I and II, that these wars aren't over in a year or so. That they take a long time, and we have to dig deep in ourselves to have the patience to let Ukraine and to support Ukraine do what they feel they got to do in terms of this offensive. And that's what we really need to do, is to push back on those people who are not patient on this.
Jim, you know, when people say that the winter is going to slow down the offensive on this, is that simply because that this part of southern Ukraine is now one of the most heavily mined areas in the world, and actually this war is very much, you know, a case of troops being on foot and advancing very slowly in a very old-fashioned form of warfare?
Well, that's right, and it's the mines and the trenches and the so-called dragon's teeth and the barbed wire. That's what's slowing them down, and that's not so weather dependent. That is there, and that is the pick and shovel work for Ukraine sappers to go through no man's land, and we're all familiar with this.
Yeah.
To go through and to pull those out. But with the winter, it's the mud, and right now, the mud isn't the same all across Ukraine. Some have it more than others, and we'll have to see. I'm not a expert on mud in Ukraine, but my understanding is that it might not be such an obstacle, the mud in the south, as it might be in other parts of Ukraine. So we'll just have to see what kind of impact the weather itself will have
Yeah.
on Ukraine.
Just finally, before we let you go, Jim, because you're always such an absolute insight into this, but Kyiv has also talked about the need for particularly demining equipment and warplanes like the F-16 fighter jets that we talked about earlier to challenge Russia's superiority in the air. How likely are Kyiv to get those jets?
Well, they're going to get the F-16s.
Enough of them?
Well, that's an interesting point.
Well, what they've asked for maybe is a better question.
Well, I think they've probably asked for more than they will end up getting, but I think they should get enough, something sufficient to at least get them started down the road, and it won't be for a while, unfortunately. I wish they had them today, but it won't be until maybe well into next year before you begin to see an initial delivery. But it's but you made an important point about the mine clearance. I think we made a big mistake by not loading them up with mine clearance equipment and training, this type of thing, early on. It seems to me that we've delivered a lot over the past couple of months, but boy, they needed to be trained on it and to have it in hand before they started this offensive. And I just don't think we did that. The F-16s, if they had them now, that would provide them air cover as those sappers go in there and try to pull out the mines. They're vulnerable today to Russian aircraft and helicopters, and I think the F-16s could keep them at bay. And I think that's why I wish they were here today. But it won't be till the third offensive next year that we'll see those F-16s. But I'd rather get them in there now in as many numbers as we can, and I think there's a lot of thanks that need to go across the alliance. The Danes, the Dutch, Romanians, others, Norway, I think, that are providing the F-16s or the training.
I'll tell you what, it's really important to note, isn't it, that no matter when this war ends, there's going to be an enormous mine-clearing job for years and years to come, isn't there?
There sure will be, and I, as well as cleanup of all kinds of munitions, including the cluster munitions. It's going to be a big cleanup, and that's got to be part of the reconstruction costs for Ukraine. I think all of us will take part in that.
Jim, always good to have your insight. Thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us tonight.
Well, thank you very much.
Jim Townsend there, former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO under both Obama and Biden.